infidels, taste my lead. Die, die, die. Ooh, I think I'll drive right through that. Look out, we're under fire, men. Stay calm, bang, 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 bang. Bang, 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 bang. Hi. Just watching Pentagon footage from the Gulf War here. Oh, no, sorry, I get carried away. This is my video game, Armageddon. My friends at Psygnosis modemed me up a copy. Amazing stuff. You can tell this is a video game and not news footage. It's so realistic looking. Blow reveille, Nancy. Die, die! Look out, look out!
Rising anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe has voted English-only sign. 40,000 tons of deadly. Armed with PCBs blew up the ozone layer today.
Standing by for solid rocket booster separation.
At ease, prisoners of gravity. This is the commander pulling rank to interrupt your regular propaganda. It's no secret that science and technology are changing the way we play, the way we work, and the way we wage war. But the fact is, technology wins wars. The first people to clue into that almost a century ago were not generals or politicians, but science fiction writers. H.G. Wells wrote several future war stories. In The War in the Air, he imagined airplanes as weapons. In The Land Ironclads, Wells predicted war with tanks. And The World Set Free involved atomic bombs, all written before World War I. During the First World War, weapons changed dramatically, but tactics didn't. Confused generals plopped their troops into the trenches, and the war in Europe became a meat grinder. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Lawrence of Arabia fought a new style of war on old-fashioned horseback. It was a one-man desert storm. Author Bruce Sterling sees Lawrence as the first modern warrior. Bruce finds a connection between Lawrence's desert exploits and future war in his novel, Islands in the Net.
Well, you know, if you look at what happened in the Gulf War, you can see that reflected in Lawrence of Arabia's military doctrines. He never fought a pitched battle head-to-head with the Turkish troops in World War I. He cut down telegraph lines and he blew up railroad bridges. And he, broke the back of the Turkish army by destroying their technical infrastructure. And that's exactly what Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf just did to Baghdad. I mean, you know, he didn't blow up that many civilians, but if you're in Baghdad now, you better like taking ferries in the dark. At the same time, the Gulf War, such a cyberpunk war, so very postmodern. I mean, it strikes me that when you see those televised missiles crashing down onto buildings, what you don't see afterwards is victims of the explosion picking bits of television camera out of their flesh. But it was raining exploding televisions in Iraq for about 2 weeks. And every bone in their society was broken and scarcely left a mark on their skin. It really was. It was an astonishing military achievement.
Martha, was the Gulf War the first science fiction war with all that high-tech weaponry?
The weaponry is not the part of that war that's interesting. It's the way that it's the public relations of that war that's really interesting, and I think that's just as science fictional. Finding a new paradigm for how to present a war to the people is a very science fictional thing that gets deeply into political science fiction. And this war was advertised and marketed so well. I was so surprised at how quickly everybody swallowed it. The idea that it was sugar-coated with, we don't want to be disloyal to our troops. And of course, I didn't want to be disloyal to our troops. I had a little lapel pin, which unfortunately I lost. It had an American flag and a peace sign on it, both. And, you know, I had a peace sign that I appended a yellow ribbon to. And people were saying, well, you can't do both. If you're against this war, you're against our troops. and when I marched down the street, I didn't know that I was accomplishing anything, but I felt that I had to say, I love my country so much that I have to criticize it now, because I know that we can do better. This is a great country, and I know that we can do better. I think that sort of patriotism is a good thing. I think the sort of patriotism that leads you to say, we're good, it's a wonderful country, it has many fine qualities, we can make it better, because we have that within us. And I think any citizen of any country, if they can do that, then they're doing a good thing.
Funny having to defend yourself for being anti-war, but it's always been dangerous to say, blessed are the peacemakers. The frenzy of pride across America over the Gulf War made me wonder if all the Vietnam protesters weren't anti-war, just anti-losing. Let's hear what others think. I'll call Dan Simmons. His Hyperion books are set against a backdrop of interstellar war. Dan, it's Commander Rick. I was wondering what you learned about war from watching it on CNN.
The war, to me, showed something that we really didn't want to be the truth, which is that our military can be effective, that our national will, whether for good or ill, can be projected efficiently and successfully for some goal, that we have to be damn careful about the goals we set politically, because although we've gone through almost 2 decades of demilitarizing our consciousness so that we always think of the military as catch-22 and MASH and screw-ups and so forth, what we saw was probably the greatest show of American efficiency since the Apollo lunar program. So essentially what I learned watching CNN is that while a lot of us were ready to fight the last war of Vietnam, talking about body bags and getting bogged down, the military had actually, for a change, learned a lesson and done something very, very efficiently.
Well, when you lose 1 soldier for every 500 you kill, you've got an efficient machine. Considering that during World War II, 100,000 innocent bystanders were killed in 1 night at Dresden, the bombing in the Gulf was pinpoint accurate. Most people can't get their morning paper delivered as close as some of those smart missiles were hitting. Now, in your Hyperion books, the military waged war in a similar, very controlled manner. What we saw in the Gulf War was almost a step in the direction of your new Bushido Code.
Warfare seems to be reversing the cycle of expanding out to include civilians, strategic bombing, wiping out each other's cities, moving back to some code of warfare where if we can't get rid of war, we can make it much more containable. And my assumption in the Hyperions is that in a society that is not eliminated warfare but sequestered it, that the warriors will go back full circle to a type of samurai code of behavior, which I think is absolutely essential in any, not just an interstellar society, but surviving as a global society. That if we can't get rid of it, we do have to regulate it. And so the new Bushido Code is obviously just a return to some Japanese sense of honor, morality, and limitation in warfare.
War is obviously a recurring theme in your work. One of your very first novellas was a Civil War story, but I've forgotten the title.
Oh, the wonderful title for my novella set in the Civil War, it's Iverson's Pits.
That
sounds
was
like a deodorant commercial, but it grew from a footnote. And it's one of the opening skirmishes of Gettysburg, in which the 12th and 20th North Carolina regiments, they weren't decimated, they were wiped out, especially the 20th. And they buried them in a mass grave, the North Carolinians, and later someone set a vineyard over the graves, and the fellow who lived there used to take some of the visiting veterans at Gettysburg and bring them to his home and offer them wine. I found this through a series of footnotes, and I found the irony of that so compelling that I knew some story had to rise out of it. And so I set the story on the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg with a veteran returning, put it in a horror format, like an EC comic, because it needed some format.
Sure.
But it was finally the scratching my itch of writing about Gettysburg.
Well, it's not just your itch. The Civil War really captures the imagination of a lot of American writers. Why do you think that is?
I agree with Shelby Foote that the Civil War is our Iliad. It is our great tragic story. It is, if all the rest of American history were to deliquesce and future historians had no access to it, that the essence of the American nature could be understood by knowing the Civil War, if that were maintained. It is the only, it's the only 4 years in which we had all of the great giants were visible, both in physical terms like Lincoln and in terms of what America stands for. So it is our Iliad.
What do you think is the legacy of the Civil War, the visible wounds that you see around you today?
They're the obvious signs all around us here in New York of the legacy of racism. When you travel through the South, there's the bitterness. I've heard speakers say to a group, America has never been invaded or occupied, so we don't know what it feels like. And I can see the Southerners in the audience just growing red, you know, you forget. And so the legacy's still there. I think in a strange sense, this terrible trauma, this massacre of the Civil War, when you study the casualty rates, when you realize the number of Americans that were slaughtered, because that's all it was, you know, since tactics didn't keep up with technology, you can't imagine the courage it took to be a foot soldier, a grunt in that war. But that bloody trauma somehow, I think, allowed the United States to survive and thrive into the 20th century.
Thanks, Dan.